Hi, my name's Brian Young. Today we're going to spend a little time talking about relationship-based discipline. The first time you found yourself dealing with a child who had just done something that required a parenting intervention, you saw what your default parenting style was. Most of us can't even remember what that was way back then. But when we talk about our role as parents as it pertains to dealing with kids' behaviors, a few names are frequently heard, whether it's discipline, behavior modification, behavior management, or something similar. The most important thing we need to think about is our role in what we see we're trying to accomplish with the interaction. The more I learn about effective parenting, the more I realize that I didn't really have that as my default when I was parenting my kids. And I don't think I'm alone in that. I remember thinking more about how I could just get these kids to mind than ever thinking about why they were doing what they were doing, or how I could help them do it differently if it wasn't giving them the outcome they were hoping for or wanting. I've learned that parenting with the only goal being just to extinguish a behavior isn't really parenting at all. Well, that might not be entirely true. It is a form of parenting, but it's what I like to refer to as warden parenting. A warden parent is one that has one goal and one goal only, and that is to see compliance from their children. They're frequently known to say things like, "Because I said so, and that's the only reason you need." Nothing says we're on the same page like a comment like that, right? A warden parent will use whatever tool is necessary at the time to gain compliance, regardless of how it's perceived by the child or whether it may have negative consequences for the child now or down the road. These folks are completely fine using intimidation, fear, threats, whatever they need to use to get a different behavior if the current one is not meeting their approval. Now, I'm not saying these are people who really are purposely doing things to harm the relationship with their kids by how they're choosing to parent, but I don't think they even take the time or opportunity to think that through, as most of the time they can actually get compliance by their demands and threats of unpleasant consequences. And then they think their parenting moment is done. There's really not much thought put into what effect their approach has on the relationship with their child, if in fact they've done anything other than set up a similar behavior consequence in the future because they haven't dealt with the reason for it in the present. A sick child, for example, who's constantly whining and moaning is, by their particular behavior, basically telling us where they are. Behaviors are really nothing more than indicators of where a child's functioning at any given moment. We can, if we choose, demand they stop whining and complaining, threaten a consequence if they don't. They may or may not even be able to change their behavior at that moment, depending on how bad they feel. But it's certainly not addressing the real issue of the sickness, what's causing him to act that way in the first place. By doing that, we're actually demanding they change their physical condition right now because we said so. And if you don't, and you know how that story ends up. One of the most important concepts I believe we must be willing to accept before we're going to be able to get and keep ourselves out of warden parent mentality is to see that effective parenting is much more concerned with future behaviors than present behaviors. If we can help a child understand what made them make a particular choice now, understand why it didn't turn out how they were expecting and hoping it maybe would, and now they may even have a consequence to deal with, then we can also help them start to see how that maybe they can make a different choice next time and not have to deal with that consequence again. If we can get our heads trained to be in that mode, those interactions will be very different, not only in that moment, but in future moments, because now we're actually aligning ourselves with our kids in an effort to make their lives more pleasant by not having to deal with those consequences again and teaching them how to do it. I believe that is when we're most effective as parents, when we're teaching. It might do us well to ask ourselves in general, as well as after a teaching moment, given the totality of the relationship with my child, is it likely he sees me being on his side? Now, that's not to say that we need to try and make sure they're never unhappy with us or mad at us. That's not realistic either. But overall, when my child is out of that moment of reactivity and is a little more receptive in thought, do they see me as an ally or an enemy? Effective parenting in general is an ongoing challenge that we all hope to be more successful at, more often than not. But parenting an abused and neglected child just adds a little more to the situation. It requires what we call trauma-informed parenting, a seemingly complicated term that really means nothing more than we need to understand and figure out what's causing the behavior in the first place, rather than just trying extinguishing it like we talked about earlier. A trauma-informed parent is one who recognizes that parenting a child who has experienced trauma is less focused on managing behavior and more focused on building relationships. When we really try to get inside an abused, neglected child's head and see the world from the perspective of someone who's unfortunately had situations in their lives where they were taught that adults, and worst case scenario, the very adults that I'm supposed to be able to rely on to take care of me, cannot be trusted, then their responses to new parents and caregivers start to make a lot more sense. As a trauma-informed parent, we understand that every interaction is a teaching interaction. Every experience a child has been written on their brain, and the traumatic ones are written in the lower parts of the brain, which are completely and totally concerned about one thing, and that's survival. When something happens to us that's potentially hurtful or harmful or threatening or intimidating, the survival area of the brain takes over and makes very detailed, specific notes about it. This isn't done just so we can remember what's happened to us necessarily, but it's more so we can protect ourselves from letting it happen to us again. Those details are stored and always available for immediate use. If we find ourselves in a situation, for example, when we see a guy who looks like that guy who hurt me before, or we see a mom standing in the kitchen with a wooden cooking spoon in her hand, like my mom was, before she lost it and hit me with it. It's like a virus checking program on your computer. It's always running in the background, helping to make sure that nothing you're doing is going to be compromised, and ready to alert you if it finds something could potentially be a threat. In considering this, it's somewhat confusing and a little bit frustrating for some people who immediately think that a child should be able to control those thoughts and not respond as if they're going to be mistreated again. After all, we're doing foster care to help protect kids, not to hurt them, so they should be able to realize they're safe just because they're in a different environment with different parents who would never treat a child like that, right? Actually, no, not right. What's really important is that understanding that part of the brain that could actually consider those facts in determining the present level of potential abuse, the upper part where that kind of thinking takes place, can actually be shut down by the lower, the bottom part, the protection and survival part. And they literally cannot think that through. That is a moment when it is absolutely critical that we as their caregivers understand the concept of trauma-informed parenting. It's right then, when they're experiencing a fight, flight, or freeze moment, that we need to be able to realize that they are not in a place where we can just talk them through it. They're not in a place where we can ask them to think about what they're about to do before they do it. They can't. It's not that they think about it and choose not to, which is very important to remember in that moment, but their survival brain has taken over and will continue to be in charge until such time that it feels the threat is decreasing and allows the upper thinking brain to come back online. Our brains are necessarily and amazingly wired that way. Protect first, think about it later. And it makes sense. If it were the other way around, if we took the time to think about whether that guy who just walked up to me and looks like that guy who hurt me before was actually going to hurt me, it might be too late and he gets me again. So those few seconds that it would take to determine whether I am in fact in danger in my upper thinking part of the brain are shut down by the lower survival part. And I just react to protect myself, just in case. As a caregiver, it's absolutely vital that we understand what's going on in the child's brain in that moment. They are in a brain state of reactivity. If we don't realize what's happening, we may react inappropriately ourselves and actually cause their survival brain to stay lit up, keeping the thinking brain shut down because the tension of the moment isn't allowing it to decrease. A trauma-informed response is critical to a child's being able to self-regulate and come back to a whole brain world. But clearly it requires that we as caregivers do not allow our own brain state to shift from reactive to receptive as well. When we as parents are in a mode of less thinking and more reacting, the outcome is usually not a good one. In talking about our responses to behaviors, it needs to be made clear that not only is it best to not use physical punishment with a child, especially an abused child, it's also not allowed by policy. Physical discipline is not an option. There are many reasons, aside from the policy issue, that mandate no physical discipline be used. Clearly, it could be a re-traumatizing event for a child. It is again re-emphasized in their lower brain that adults hit and hurt you. Interestingly, we know that behaviors that are reinforced are most likely to be repeated. So it's actually possible that giving that behavior that kind of response could in fact invite it to happen again. Physical discipline also does not help in the development of self-regulation, which is not innate and must be learned. What it does is teach that when you're angry, it's okay to hit somebody. Another important point that will help caregivers and be protected from potential allegations of abuse themselves by never crossing that line. You do not want to find yourself in a situation where you're trying to justify that attention getter as just being your way of letting that child know you were serious. But as important as all of those things are, and I believe they are, in my mind, the most important damage done is the damage to the relationship that we're trying to build. How can we even imagine to get them to trust their world again if they continue to experience those kinds of behaviors from the very people who are supposed to be protecting them again? They don't come to us at the 0 point on the relationship scale. They've already had experiences in their short lives that have pushed them way back into negative territory. So while we're just starting to build a relationship with them, they're pretty sure it's not going to work out, and they're already going to be inclined to be a little more on the defensive and ready to protect from being hurt again than being willing to forget everything that's happened to them in the past. Our brains aren't wired that way for good reasons. So with all that said, how do we help them? If we're to be positive influences and examples in our children's lives, understand why they may behave based on how they've had results from previous life experiences, factor in where they may be functioning developmentally, so we're interacting with them on a level and in a language they understand and can relate to. Respond appropriately to help them rewire their brains to behave differently next time and increase their chances of having a happier and healthier life. How do we do it? Keeping in mind what we've talked about so far, that a child's behavior is really just an indicator of where they're functioning at any given moment, and especially remembering the brain information as it pertains to them and us in any teaching situation. Here are some examples and suggestions. I think it's absolutely critical that when a child's placed in your home, you quickly try to establish a sense of consistency and predictability. When I don't have to wonder about what's going to happen to me every minute, and I'm comfortable that what is about to happen to me isn't going to hurt me, then my brain is able to spend more time focusing on things like self-regulation and rewiring itself to be able to trust again. I'm more willing to participate and less likely to fight. As human beings, we are wired to connect to each other relationally. If we as caregivers can create an environment of safety for our kids, it will allow them to be in a better position to do that. Mary Vicario and Carol Hudgens Mitchell, both Ohio trauma experts, developed a safety message for caregivers to use. It's an effective way to help establish rules and link them to the safety of a child. The safety script is, this is a safe place, and I won't let anyone hurt or hit or kick or push you, so I can't let you hurt or hit or kick or push anyone because this is a safe place. The script does a really good job establishing the reason for the rule, safety. It's not just to make the child deal with another rule. It has a purpose, to make them safe. They are far more likely to have some buy-in when they see how they can benefit personally from behaving differently. Which brings me to my next suggestion. Help them see how they can benefit from managing their behavior differently. Most people, not just children, are not terribly interested in doing something that's different or initially uncomfortable if they don't see a benefit in it for themselves. Too often I think people are so focused on throwing down a negative consequence to punish a behavior that they forget there's another alternative. Positive consequences are far more effective in encouraging and inviting behavior than negative consequences are when they just demand it. The positive ones offer a benefit and invite a more receptive brain state, while the negative ones demand compliance and result in a reactive brain state. If I have a child that loves a particular video game, for example, the concept of using positive consequences to invite behavior change puts me in a position where I can offer 5 or 10 extra minutes of the video game if the child attempts a different behavior, as opposed to the well-known and overused default of threatening the loss of the video game altogether if they don't do what I want. One invites us to be on the same page, benefit together. The other draws a line in the sand and says, I have the power to make your life miserable if you don't do what I say because I'm the parent and you're the child, putting us not only on different pages, but probably in different books. What we're trying to do is establish the desired connections in their brain by repeatedly experiencing the behavior change. So if it takes offering a benefit to get them to do that without putting their brains in a non-learning reactive state by demanding and threatening, seems to me like it would have a higher probability of success. Along those same lines, another concept that helps reinforce the brain connections we're looking for is feedback. While better than no feedback at all, I'm not necessarily talking about things like awesome or good job. I'm talking about more specific situation-oriented feedback. The kind that starts when a child makes any movement towards accomplishing what their task is, as opposed to waiting until they make whatever effort, if any, then tell them what they could have done differently and give them a consequence if they don't. It's like the hot-cold game that we've all played. When the person is told that their job is to find whatever object's been hidden in the room and they start moving, if the game is played as intended, they get immediate feedback the second they move. Warmer, colder, freezing cold, hot, warmer, scalding hot, whatever it is, the person is basically guided to the object by constant specific feedback. And the result is usually positive. Think what would happen if the person started moving and all they heard was, good job, awesome, or keep it up, or something like that. While not necessarily negative, it's also not necessarily helpful either. And worse, think of the outcome if a person was told what they're supposed to do, they start wandering and they get no feedback whatsoever. After a short period of time, most people are deciding they don't really want to play this game anymore, and so they don't care to keep looking. So if we want to introduce and reinforce certain behaviors that may not initially be comfortable for a child, we need to reinforce each and every little effort in that direction, like the hot-cold game. By doing that, we can help guide them little by little to whatever goal they're looking for, together, strengthening the relationship as we do. For example, let's say we're trying to help Julie learn that after we eat, we want the dishes to be rinsed and put in the dishwasher. A warden parent approach would be to tell her what she needs to do, sit back and observe what she does, tell her what she did wrong afterwards, and threaten a consequence if she doesn't do it better next time. Clearly not the approach that accomplishes what we're trying to do in building positive relationships. Alternatively, let's look at what the interaction might be like with some situation-specific feedback. We're sitting at the dinner table after our meal, and we say something like, okay, so after we eat, we like to get the dishes rinsed off and put in the dishwasher so they can get washed and the kitchen can be cleaned up. Let me show you how to do that. as we get up with our dishes in our hands and head towards the sink. When Julie gets up and grabs her dishes, she gets a positive, immediate feedback. Thank you for doing that. You were such a quick learner, or something like that. We take our dishes over to the sink, and then we show her what we mean as we rinse ours and put them in the dishwasher. As she starts, she gets feedback as she goes, focusing on the positive. You're doing such a good job being careful with that plate. Look how good you did getting all that stuff off of that fork. Let's say as she's rinsing out her glass, you notice she only does the outside. Focusing on the positive with a teaching moment follow-up, we could say something like, you did such a great job on getting everything off the outside of that glass when you put it under the water. How do you think we could get the stuff off of the inside of the glass? Let's say she then tells you that she thinks by letting the water go in the inside of the glass, that would work. And we look at her and say, exactly. That's so smart. That should do it. Let's give it a try. Then there's the reinforcement after she does it. You get the idea how this works. What we're after are opportunities to reward behavior that heads in the direction of where we want it to go as we go. If we just stood there staring at her as she tried, then told her what she did wrong with a frustrated face and no helpful feedback, the outcome with the relationship would be very different. By reinforcing specifically, her brain makes connections specifically. So finally, as we look at this amazing opportunity we have to help these kids learn to trust the world again, in spite of what they've been through, let's stay focused on the reality that the brain can be rewired. Up until the day we die, our brains have capacity for change. If we focus more on where the child is in any given situation and create, more often than not, a safe environment that encourages and allows for change, rather than the one that demands compliance, we will have done all that can be expected of us as caregivers, and hopefully all that will be necessary for them to see a benefit in learning to manage their behaviors in a more positive and productive way. Doctors Bruce Perry and Daniel Siegel, two highly internationally recognized researchers on brain development and how a child's brain is affected by abuse and neglect, have both said that the majority of all they have learned through their research, the different interventions to help a child heal from what they've been through and what they've experienced, everything that can be done to achieve a better outcome for abused and neglected kids, requires first and foremost a foundation of supportive caregivers in a positive, healthy environment. That is something we can all do. Thank you.